Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Canada Pavilion at COP15, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lauren Small, and I'm the Director of the Canada Pavilion with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Bonjour à tous. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Pavillon du Canada à la COP15 et merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Lauren Small et je suis la directrice du Pavillon du Canada avec l'Environnement et Changement climatique Canada. Just before we start our next exciting session, if I could just remind everybody to please put your phones on mute. Donc, si vous pouvez mettre vos téléphones sur sourdine, ça serait apprécié. Si vous avez besoin des écouteurs, c'est juste au fond de salle avec Nicolas. If you need simultaneous interpretation, Nicolas has some écouteurs with him. This session will also be recorded. Cette session sera enregistrée. C'est avec plaisir que je vous présente notre prochain événement, Solutions naturelles pour le climat, collaboration transformatrice pour une économie positive pour la nature et le climat, organisé par Nature United Canada. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our next event, Natural Climate Solutions, Transformative Collaborations for Nature and Climate Positive Economy, hosted by Nature United Canada. This event will be moderated by Catherine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy. Catherine is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. In her role as Chief Scientist, Catherine is responsible for the Nature Conservancy's wider portfolio of global climate advocacy and adaptation. Catherine is also a distinguished professor and endowed chair in the public policy at Texas Tech University. Please join me in welcoming Catherine.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome everyone to such a typically Canadian day. Don't you just love the snow out there? As long as you don't have to go anywhere. So I want to begin by acknowledging the lands on which we stand. These are the lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. They're the custodians of these lands and waters. As you know, or you might not know, Montreal is also known as Jogawe. It's historically the gathering place for many First Nations, as are many of our cities in Canada. Today, Montreal is home to a very diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And here in Canada, we strive to support the authority and the capacity of Indigenous peoples to steward their land and waters, which is critical for the future of healthy ecosystems and communities. We're here today to talk about natural climate solutions. And people often say, well, what is a natural climate solution? In a nutshell, it is a solution that involves nature to tackle climate, but it also addresses biodiversity at the same time. I'm a climate scientist, but I know that we don't have time for solutions that only have single wins. We need solutions with multiple wins. Wins for nature, wins for people, wins for justice, wins for equity, and wins for climate too. So that's what we're here to talk about. Natural climate solutions to protect, manage, and restore nature. I was at COP27 in Egypt, and wherever I went, I heard conversations about natural climate solutions. In the pavilions, in the hallways, in the negotiations. But they are also part of an effective global biodiversity framework. The science tells us that people are starting to wake up to this potential. More people are concerned about these issues. More people are aware of these issues. More action is happening on Indigenous lands, on agricultural lands, managed forests. But the science is clear that we need to do more and we need to do it faster. So today's event is going to begin with an overview of what the science says, of how Canada is embracing the potential of NCS, and where our future opportunities lie. And then we'll get into a panel where we ask those tough questions for ag, for land, for Indigenous lands. What more needs to be done? What is being done, but what do we need for the future? So this discussion will include a representative from our Indigenous communities and experts in the fields of conservation, forestry, and agriculture. After that, we will turn to your questions. And this is a small group, so we're not doing Slido or anything like that. We're literally doing old-fashioned questions. They will come at the end, so as we go along, be thinking about the questions that you have. But first of all, I want to introduce our first speaker. The Honourable Marie-Claude Bibeau is Canada's Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. She was first elected in 2015 as the Minister of International Development in the Francophonie, where, under her leadership, Canada adopted a feminist international assistance policy. Very near and dear to my heart is your commitment to the empowerment of women. And for that, she was given the World Vision Voice of Children Award and the CARE Global Leaders Network Humanitarian Award. I love the fact that a significant climate solution is the education of women and girls. And so she was working on climate solutions for a very long time, although we never even called them that at that time. In June 2019, she launched the first ever food policy for Canada to strengthen food security for Canadians, which is top of mind right now. And she also served as the executive director of the Sherbrooke Museum of Nature and Science, which I also love because museums are the way that we bring children in and engage their curiosity on science. So welcome, Minister.
Merci, Catherine. Bonjour à tous. Thank you to Nature United for organizing this important discussion. It's great to see so many different sectors represented on this panel. To address the theme of the discussion this afternoon, there is no question that the Government of Canada is a strong supporter of natural climate solutions. Forests, wetlands, grasslands, and farmland have the ability to absorb and store large amounts of carbon, reduce the effects of climate change, keep our air and water clean, and provide habitat for wildlife. En tant que ministre de l'Agriculture, j'ai été témoin plus d'une fois au cours des dernières années des effets dévastateurs des changements climatiques sur les cultures, sur la sécurité alimentaire, sur la capacité de nos agricultrices et agriculteurs à bien vivre de leur production. L'agriculture ne fait pas partie du problème, l'agriculture fait partie de la solution. Et je tiens à remercier les agriculteurs et agricultrices du Canada pour leur engagement ferme envers une agriculture durable. Nous reconnaissons
sustainable agriculture. We recognize that they need official support to accelerate the rhythm and to become more and more resilient in face of climate change, which is why Canada is adopting a global approach.
more than $5 billion over 10 years under the Natural Climate Solutions Fund by planting 2 billion trees, restoring ecosystems, and improving land management practices. And we work closely with Indigenous peoples, the best guardians of biodiversity, on nature conservation and protection projects. In Saskatchewan, we are supporting our first ever living lab to be led by an Indigenous community. I'm also particularly proud that Canada has established a nationwide network of 13 agro-ecosystem living labs to innovate nature-based agricultural solutions. Each Living Labs brings regional organizations, farmers, scientists, Indigenous groups, and other sector partners together in the field to co-develop, test, and evaluate beneficial on-farm management practices that work on the farm. If you're still in Montreal on Sunday, don't miss the opportunity to learn more about this innovative Canadian initiative during a panel and a discussion where some of our living labs will be presented. Our funding is also helping farmers to take immediate action through our On-Farm Climate Action Fund. De la Colombie-Britannique au Canada Atlantique, 12 organisations agricoles
to Alberta and 12 organizations distributing funds to help farmers to target 3 priority areas: nitrate management, coverage, and crop rotation. We need to recognize that the environmental measures on the farm, they have advantages beyond the farm. Indeed, they provide ecosystemic services which benefit everyone, like biodiversity and conservation of soil and water. Our new resilient agricultural landscape program aims to recognize and to pay for these practices. This program will help the farmers to preserve their agricultural land with measures concerning prairies, wetlands, water streams.
Reaching our climate goals, we need to move forward together. On Monday, I launched national consultations on a new sustainable agriculture strategy. This strategy will help ensure that Canada's agriculture sector is ready and able to recover quickly from extreme events, thrive in a changing climate, meet our climate goals and feed the world, and sustain our farmers' livelihoods. We want to strengthen how we work together at all levels of government with Indigenous communities, farmers, ranchers, their industry representatives, scientists, ecologists, and other partners. That's why we are also creating an advisory committee, including producers, industry, and other stakeholders. Members will work together to keep everyone connected and on the same page as we work towards a shared vision for Canada to continue building an environmentally sustainable food system within the broader context of social and economic challenges and opportunities in the sector. This strategy will be finalized in the next year. There's no question that partnership is the most powerful way to make progress on the immense challenges facing our planet. We need to join forces, as we are doing here in Montreal, to chart a way forward together. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your remarks. Now, for our second speaker, I am delighted to be able to introduce my colleague, Hadley Archer. Now, you might say, Hadley Archer is from Nature United. How is he your colleague? In 79 countries, the Nature Conservancy is known as the Nature Conservancy. In one country, ours, it's known as Nature United. So when you hear Nature United, that is the Canadian affiliate of the Nature Conservancy. And I have to say, I love the title Nature United because isn't that what this is about? All of Nature United, including us humans. So Hadley is our executive director. And he is well known in Canada because he previously worked for WWF's Global Forest Program, where he was their VP in charge of strategic partnerships and funding. He also worked for the Forest Stewardship Council, and before that, he worked with Procter & Gamble Canada. So, Hadley, come and tell us more about natural climate solutions in Canada.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Minister Bibeau, for your remarks and for your leadership in this area. Thank you to our panelists for joining us this afternoon. I know it's a busy time and probably lots of demands on your time, but we're delighted you could be with us, and to everyone who's here. As Catherine said, Nature United, we just like to be different in Canada, right? We're leading the way, so why not lead the way on our name? I will just share a few words to try and set the stage about natural climate solutions. We've already heard about the definition and what they are, but I really want to help underscore the potential for natural climate solutions to help us move beyond targets and words into action on the ground, where we can invest in nature, not a novel idea, but where we can invest in nature and really harness the power of nature to help us tackle both the climate and biodiversity crises, and do this in a way that is good not just for nature, but for people, for communities, for economies, for our thriving forestry and agriculture sectors. We really fundamentally believe that these solutions, we can't have solutions that are either good for the environment or for the economy, or that only tackle climate or only tackle biodiversity loss. We need these multiple wins, as Catherine said. So natural climate solutions, as has been mentioned, is simply how we manage our lands, how we manage our forests, wetlands, agriculture lands, and forests, how we protect them, how we manage them, and how we restore them when they're degraded. So with the second largest landmass of any country in the world, we really wanted to answer the question, what's the potential for natural climate solutions in Canada? Our global affiliate had already done a study put out in 2017 that found that 1/3 of the emission reductions needed by 2030 can be met or found in nature. So we wanted to understand that for Canada. So we pulled together, actually, Dr. Drever, who's in the audience, was the lead scientist, and he and 37 other scientists from government, industry, academia, nonprofit sector, set out to answer the question. And what they found is that, in fact, 11% of Canada's current annual emissions, or 1/4 of the emission reductions we need to meet our 2030 goals, can be found in nature. And moreover, these solutions are readily available and they're cost effective. More than 2/3 are available at less than $100 a ton. So how do we realize this incredible opportunity? First and most importantly, as has already been stated, it's critical to understand that this is about supporting rights holders and landowners and land managers to understand the opportunities, to understand what the barriers are and what the enablers are, and to help them adopt these practices. In most cases, these aren't new practices. They're not revolutionizing how we do forestry or how we farm or ranch. These are about identifying what practices exist and how to accelerate the adoption and how to make the climate and nature smart choice the financially and culturally right choice. I'm sure our panelists will elaborate on this, but just to give two high-level examples. In the forest sector, our study found that protecting old-growth forests that are rich in biodiversity and rich in carbon storage is a critical opportunity. But to combine that with how we manage our forests and adopting practices for improved forest management that enable the forest sector to continue to be a thriving part of our economy, but that at the same time understand how the sector can contribute to climate mitigation. And that gives way to the potential for carbon offsets. One of the best examples in the world of that is in the Great Bear Rainforest, and I'm quite sure my friend Dallas will tell you about that in a few minutes. In the agriculture sector, practices like cover cropping and no-till farming and for our nutrient management, these hold tremendous potential. And so helping farmers understand how to adopt these practices, in some cases they're already being adopted, but how to accelerate that. And again, what are the barriers to adoption? How can we help de-risk the adoption of these practices so that they can get over the initial cost hurdles and start to do this more systematically? The second, we need the right policy framework. And we're very fortunate, as Minister Bibeau has said, that Canada is an early adopter in adopting natural climate solutions. It's in our emission reductions plan. Resources have been mobilized, and support is already being available to forestry sector, to agriculture sector, and of course to Indigenous communities through this government's incredible commitment to 30 by 30 protection and to supporting Indigenous-led conservation. And thirdly, we need the private sector. There's no question there is a cost to this, and we need the private sector's engagement. And it's imperative, we've heard throughout this conference, in fact, the private sector has shown up in unprecedented numbers at a nature COP. And we're hearing loud and clear that the business sector understands there's a risk and an imperative to investing in biodiversity conservation, whether it's the financial sector, who are increasingly understanding their exposure to biodiversity loss and the connection between climate and biodiversity, or major retailers or agri-food producers who've made bold commitments to net zero, and they know that the majority of those reductions need to come in their supply chains. They need to be partnering with and working with their suppliers. So today's panel is about carrying this conversation forward, learning from those on the ground and in the industries that are already adopting these practices, what they're doing, what's working, what are some of the barriers and challenges, so that together we can really seize this incredible opportunity. And really Canada, there's no reason why Canada should not be a global leader in advancing natural climate solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister, and thank you, Hadley, for those remarks. Now, the organization of the stage is a little awkward. I'm going to invite you to leave the stage, which requires passing behind me. Thank you. And I would like to invite our panelists to enter the stage now. Go ahead and take your seats, and I will introduce you as you join us. Thank you. Go ahead, Kate. let's see, I think, yeah, Dallas is on that side, then Kate, then Frank, and then Darcy right there. Perfect. We have a wonderful set of panelists for you today. So remember, as we speak, I have a few questions for them, but you can have questions for them too. I'm going to begin with Dallas Smith. Dallas is the president of the Namaqualas Council. He has spent the majority of his career working to bring greater human well-being and capacity to the nations of the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia. Welcome, Dallas. Kate Lindsay is Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer for the Forest Products Association of Canada, and she is a biologist. Welcome, Kate. Yes. Frank is the Director of Environment and Science Policy with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. And he has a lot of experience gathering stakeholder consensus and input on policy positions because our farmers are essential to our policies. Welcome, Frank. And last but not least, my colleague, Darcy Vetter. Darcy Vetter is the global head of our Policy and Government Relations program in the Global Nature Conservancy, of which Nature United is an affiliate. And she was formerly the chief agricultural negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is a presidential appointment with the rank of ambassador. Welcome, Darcy. Let's make sure this is working. Can you hear me? Yes, it is working. Great. So here we are. We had COP27 in Egypt just a few weeks ago. Now this is COP15 here in Montreal. And there has been growing recognition, especially over the past 2 years with the pandemic, that ecosystem health and human health are intimately connected. We can't have one without the other. Our health is the health of the planet. So what new opportunities does this raise for nature-based climate solutions, the recognition that we are part of nature and a healthy nature means that our health benefits too? Who would like to start with that question? We'll ask all of you, so go ahead, Dallas.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I would almost turn it around a little bit and say, where I come from, our people have done that for 14,000 years. And without going into the whole colonization thing, we've started to find a way of reintroducing those values back of the earth as a caretaker and a giver, and understanding how the commodification of resources and values fit within that. And I think the discussion has advanced significantly, at least in the 25 years that I've been doing this, to where people realize that Indigenous communities are a part of a healthy ecosystem and environment. We're not simply dependent on them. And our years of battle in the Great Bear Rainforest with both industry, environmentalists, government, we were able to continue to just chart the path that our elders led before us to get us to realize that it has to be nature-based solutions that are going to get us through the challenges that we have in front of us.
Thank you. I love that you've seen significant change in the last 20 years. That's very encouraging. Now, Kate, health is probably, at least human health, is probably not something that you heard a lot of in forest work until recently. But how does it help to spur the awareness that our health is the health of the planet? How does that help to spur natural climate solutions, in your opinion?
Thank you, Catherine. And that's a great question. I think just a little bit building on, the forest sector in Canada has really been working on climate change solutions and conservation, understanding that really our sector and the people that work and live and recreate in these areas rely on these ecosystems, and they need to be healthy. But I like the health angle because I think what I've been thinking about a lot lately is that our ecosystems are being affected by climate change. We see this with fire and flooding, extreme heat. And so, we really are most of the forests in Canada are public forests, so managed collaboratively, industry, Indigenous peoples, the public have a say in how forests are managed. And so increasingly we're hearing from communities that we want to ensure that we have resilient forests and resilient ecosystems moving forward. And so that does include wetland conservation, ensuring that the species that are being planted are adapted to a future climate, and then being ensuring that we're not wasting the resource, so that we're using it to the best and the highest value that we can. So, yeah.
I'm glad you brought that word up. Resilience is one of my favorite words. Because if we have resilient ecosystems, if we have resilient human systems, then whatever shocks get thrown at them, they can still stand. So, Frank, in agriculture, farmers are very conscious of health, soil health, the health of crops, the health of livestock. But of course, all of that relates to human health as well. So have you seen the conversation around the health of ecosystems, the health of agricultural systems, and human health? Have you seen that changing in recent years?
Yeah, we definitely have. We've in the last couple of years, we've gotten quite involved, I think, with some of our industry partners in looking at some of the benefits, for example, of ecosystem services, co-benefits they offer to producers, as well as how those stewardship practices can really enhance the production of food, as well as the health of biodiversity. Like the Canadian Wetlands Roundtable, for example, which we co-chair with the Ducks Unlimited Canada. We recently received funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada to look at developing a framework to help value those services. And the idea, of course, is not to specifically put a dollar cultural value, a dollar, a dollar environmental value, but to really just take everything into one single context and look at it like, what is the social, environmental, and economic value that this does bring? How do you define that, and how does it look? I think it's a massive undertaking. I know we're well up to the task, especially with some of the experts we've gone on board with. But yeah, my hope is we'll see some results in March.
Excellent. That's very good news. Now, Darcy, I'm going to ask you something slightly different, which is this. Doing natural climate solutions right requires a lot of different skills. You need the science, obviously, but you also need the monitoring, the verification, the ability to broker negotiations and deals, to engage different financial tools. And I feel like you've been sort of embedded in that community for a very long time, of bringing together all kinds of different partners to make these solutions work. So how do you see natural climate solutions bringing people together? What areas of common interest do you feel like have been identified with some people who might ordinarily not even be in the same room, let alone the same page?
It's a very good question, and I think some of the answers to this previous question really spoke to the different ways that people value both the outputs of agriculture and value nature. And if you think about, you can use different tools to express those values in different ways. And so, the negotiations around how does soil carbon fit into, tradable carbon offsets or insets? How do we measure that? And that can lead into a global marketplace where a ton is a ton is a ton. If we sequester a ton of carbon in a field in Canada, that helps us all globally. But when we think about natural climate solutions and using nature to sequester that ton, you may see a different market, so to speak, around the local impacts of that biodiversity. And we've talked about the First Nations communities and how they value nature as a partner and a member of their community, not just an asset, so to speak. And so you might have other opportunities to bring people together then to preserve watersheds that have local value, both economically, spiritually, and for health. We all need clean water to drink. And so I think as we look at the keepers of the land, whether those are farmers or ranchers or our Indigenous communities, how are they adding value to their neighbors? How are they adding value to their region, to their nation, to the globe? And how can we find ways to then reinforce that value in different, to use the economic term, different markets, but perhaps different partnerships and collaborations to support that transition to more regenerative practices, where in many cases farmers, private landowners, foresters may need that assistance to be able to implement those new practices. So I think we have to look at the different circles of community that we can engage for that co-investment in the activities we know are so important to both protecting biodiversity and protecting our climate.
Well, that's the perfect setup to ask our other panelists about this question, because speaking of different circles, we have three very different circles here. And each of your circles, agriculture, forestry, and our First Nations and Indigenous peoples, you've been doing nature-based climate solutions for a long time before we even had that term. So as this concept has risen to the forefront of people's awareness, as more and more people, like I said, when we were in Egypt at COP, nature-based climate solutions was on everybody's lips. as people are aware that this is a significant solution to the climate crisis and to the biodiversity crisis, what new opportunities have you seen arising to sort of emphasize what you might have already been doing or to engage people in new efforts? Dallas?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's been interesting over my career to watch us go from being a stakeholder in our own land base to leading the discussion now. And I think one of the things that I grow comfort with every day is more of our communities are starting to realize the solutions we bring forward are climate change solutions, and they're global. And so to go from looking at your own watershed, your own backyard, your own territory, to understand the impact that that could have at a global level keeps us from being complacent as leadership. We're being driven by our communities to keep raising that bar forward. And I'll use carbon credits as an example, trying to explain carbon credits to First Nations communities. And it came down to saying, okay, we're creating opportunity for someone else to pollute. And that helped us realize that that's not the solution. That's simply a goal. That's simply something to help us work towards a solution by bringing in much needed capital and opportunity, but we can't stop there. And so now we got to go on to different initiatives. And that's why Indigenous protected areas and conservation areas are really going to be key in helping Canada meet its 30 by 30 obligations, which will again help the rest of the world find that pathway.
I love that. And you're right. When you try to explain something, sometimes clarity emerges. So, Frank, let's talk about the farming community, the ag community. How has conceptualizing nature-based climate solutions and natural climate solutions as an actual tool for climate action, how has that sort of crystallized or even catalyzed action among farmers?
I would say honestly, it's given, I think, great incentive to not so much catalyze action, but to really enhance activities that have been taking place for decades. I think farmers do, as we say, are stewards of the land in terms of best management practices, and really, I think what the NCS funding has really brought is a good source of potential economic stress alleviation when it comes to enhancing those best practices, like as we mentioned, cover cropping, intercropping. The last year, what we've seen from a lot of our members obviously has been a bit difficult in terms of increasing fuel prices, price for fertilizers obviously. And so it does offer that peace of mind to ensure that those best practices can be enhanced. And I think we're quite excited. It provides a good opportunity to look at, what can take place across which growing regions in Canada, to really try to identify and make them more regionally specific in terms of what works best where. And that, of course, touched on the Living Labs program, which we're well appreciative of as well.
Many new opportunities for regional communities that needed new opportunities. And then, last but not least, with forests, here in Canada, we've been thinking about sustainable forestry for a very long time. I remember, and you probably do too, that when I was in university, all my friends would go tree planting in the summer, and that's how they made their money. So we've been very conscious of the fact that we live in a land that is full of trees, and you can never have too many trees. But now that we actually understand that not only are trees incredible for biodiversity, they are incredible for resources, but they are also incredible for sucking carbon out of the air and turning it into trees. What new opportunities do you see in forestry?
That's a great question. And I've been reflecting, that a lot of these solutions were being worked on before the term natural climate solutions. But I would say, kudos to Dr. Drever and for helping to quantify those pathways and bring a common language in how we talk about them. The Canadian Forest Service has also been working on how we quantify the mitigation pathways in forestry. And so, building a little bit on the, how we work together and the different actors. So forest sector's been working with organizations like Ducks Unlimited Canada for a long time. And the primary purpose was to protect habitat for waterfowl. But now we know that those wetlands store a whole bunch of carbon. And so we've been actually working with different universities to do core samples and to quantify the carbon in those wetlands and peatlands, and those are within a sustainable forest management plan. So we can start to quantify those actions that have the biggest benefit from a carbon perspective as well as adaptation. And then the other area is really around trees sequester carbon. That carbon can get locked into the actual wood that comes out of the forest. And if it's put into a long-lived wood product, something like a building particularly mass timber that's going to be there for a long time, it's also holding that carbon. So it's not being re-released into the atmosphere. And then that new forest is being regenerated to start that cycle again. So there's lots of natural climate solutions across the supply chain that we're looking at. And having these studies and these quantifications and pathways has helped us talk about them. And so people can understand the benefits and how those can contribute to Canada's net zero targets, but also globally.
So a new way of filtering your decisions and making decisions, recognizing benefits that we might not have been looking at before.
Exactly, yeah.
Excellent. So here we are in Canada, where the government has put $5 billion towards nature-based climate solutions. And in the United States, what's the total right now around for federal funding of natural climate solutions?
I don't know if I know that if they've sort of divided it up that way. In agriculture alone, some of our climate smart commodities pilot program is about $3.5 billion focused on, again, those natural climate solutions, but there may be more across other sectors.
So, and that actually highlights something important, which is that it isn't always called that, but it's still working together with nature for solutions. So each of you represents a sector that partners with the federal government on many of these initiatives. And Dallas, if I could start with you, we just saw that big $800 million investment in Indigenous-led conservation projects. What opportunities, but also what challenges do you see for First Nations working with the government as a partner in these conservation efforts?
Elections. In all reality, I think that's why Indigenous people have to lead these climate-based solutions, because we don't have political stripes and different priorities. And so we're overly enthused of the commitment of the Government of Canada to start us in the right direction. And it's important for us to make significant progress on that, because governments change. And so people change, priorities change, but if Indigenous people are given the capacity to chart that path forward and break that ground that really needs to be broken, or break that ceiling that needs to be broken, we have a lot more success opportunity, because it's community driven as opposed to politically driven.
That's an excellent point. So I have always thought of this as a sovereignty issue, but what you've pointed out is it's a consistency issue. You will always be there. You will always be leading, no matter who is in power and who is saying what. And that's why it's so important that these initiatives be led by the peoples. Thank you. So, Kate, in the forestry sector. So, as we heard from the minister, the government is planting trees, the government is investing in nature. What do you see from the industry perspective about the opportunities and the challenges and/or in partnering with the government on this work?
Well, and I think 2 billion trees is a great program, and it's great to have ambition. To be honest, the forest sector, we regenerate all the trees that we harvest, so for the most part, we're not accessing that fund. But there's opportunities with legacy roads or other resource sectors that we can actually go in and help regenerate those areas. For us, I think the opportunity with government is, we've been working really hard, and we were at Kyoto and Paris, and now to say, how do we present to the government the opportunities that we see where industry and companies and partners, Indigenous peoples, are ready to work together faster on some of these opportunities? And then what is the right funding programs? What is the right policy? Is there policy coherence for us to really accelerate on those? So that's what we would like to work with government on. We see opportunities, there's an interest. I'm a bit envious of the sustainable agriculture strategy. I would like to have a forestry strategy, but we can work on that moving forward to really work together and put those opportunities together, and then identify the barriers so we can move forward quickly.
Well, so speaking of the sustainable ag policy, what do you see as the biggest opportunities and/or the biggest challenges for the ag industry in Canada?
Oh, sure. I think one of my favorites, both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, is research into, as we talked about a bit earlier, quantification and measurement, I think especially. Over the last year or so, we've reached out and engaged with a number of organizations, such as Carbon Asset Solutions down in the US, also based in Australia, as well as Terra Mera, an organization from out in BC, on technology that helps farms directly and voluntarily measure their tons of emission reductions. So our hope is that this will be able to go a long ways in terms of possibly being linked to the federal carbon offset protocols so that farms could receive, more dollars per ton of carbon they do sequester in terms of their biological emissions. I think the main challenge we are seeing here is a lot of these innovations are happening in the private sector, which of course are tied to voluntary offset protocols. We know that makes a bit of a challenge for government because those voluntary offset protocols, at times, there's concern about verification behind them. And the reductions are counted towards the national inventory reporting. But we do see great opportunity. And if you look at the actual equipment that is coming online, coming available, perhaps those concerns can be addressed. And if they can be used to, basically measure sequestration in both those markets, we'd go a long ways.
And that issue is something that we at the Nature Conservancy and Nature United as scientists are looking at. So which agricultural practice puts the most carbon into the soil? How long does it stay in the soil? You need these questions answered because a farmer is going to make a choice on what they do depending on how much credit they get for it. And that's where I think science can really come in. So Darcy, I'm going to ask you to answer this question twice because I'm going to ask you to answer it from the perspective of somebody who worked in the U.S. federal government, but then also from the perspective of somebody who now leads our external affairs and government relations for a very large international NGO, the Nature Conservancy, which works with governments and with all kinds of other entities around the world. So first of all, let's start with the U.S. example. When you were in agriculture, working with all kinds of stakeholders across the country, what were the greatest opportunities, and then also what were some of the greatest challenges to getting all those stakeholders at the table to speak with the federal government about these types of solutions?
Sure. So I think part of the challenge in getting everyone on the same page is simply the diversity of U.S. agriculture, which is very similar to what we see in Canada, right? The challenge that a pork producer might have versus a cotton grower in the southern United States are somewhat different in terms of even the capital required for them to invest or harvest or change practices, how vertically integrated their markets are. Whether they were reaching end consumers who might be interested in how their product is grown, or whether their product went into an animal food supply chain that maybe has some less interest in looking at those practices. So the sheer variety of U.S. agriculture means that you have to sort of engage producers in different ways, because different technologies, different opportunities to earn a premium for good practices are there by crop. And really, I think both as a former USG official and in my current chair at the Nature Conservancy, a lot of this comes down to farmer choice and farmer options. And so the way that, it's a farm bill year in the United States, which means every 5 years we sort of refresh our agricultural policy. And as we look at what is it that we want coming out of, agricultural policy in the United States, it's really about producer options. And so the way that we're thinking about engaging in this farm bill process is to say that if I'm a farmer and I'm deciding what I'm going to do on my farm this year, we should create a policy environment where the regenerative choice is as available, accessible, affordable, and as culturally acceptable as the other alternatives. And we don't have that right now. We don't necessarily have financing mechanisms that are patient enough or provide longer-term payback periods to allow some of these more regenerative practices to start paying dividends. Maybe you don't have access to cover crop seeds, or you need a little more help buying those seeds in the fall to be able to plant them that wasn't normally in your business plan, for example. There may not be as much access to extension services. So our Natural Resource Conservation Service in the U.S. works with farmers in the field to say, here's how you plant a cover crop. Here's how you crimp it down in the fall to be prepared for planting in the spring. Those are new practices that farmers need to learn. And the socially acceptable piece is not a small thing. Farmers watch what their neighbors are doing. So I am the daughter of an organic farmer who went organic in 1975. And our neighbors thought we were nuts. My sister and I talk about crying on the school bus because our friends would be like, my dad says your dad is crazy, and your ditches are full of weeds, and what are you guys doing? You don't know what's up. We're still farming, so we weren't totally crazy, right? Our neighbors now call us and say, hey, I'm not sure I want to go organic, but how do I reduce that pesticide use? How do I lower my fertilizer bill in a time like now where those prices are really high? But it was some hard years, right, to persevere through that. And even our ag extension agents were like, we don't really know how to help you. We encourage you to just do what your neighbors are doing. So some of the pilot projects, what we heard Minister Bibeau say today, this climate smart commodities program in the United States, where we see our governments championing, trying something new, like that's really culturally important. And I think we all need to lean into the idea that we should support farmers to take these calculated risks that have huge benefits if and when they pay off, and that there will be some false starts, but that sense of both a social and an economic co-investment in outcomes, I think, is critically important as well.
Which feeds perfectly into the second half of the question, which is, you represent policy for, like I said, a very large NGO, and NGOs often work sort of as a bridge, right? Connecting other organizations, other stakeholders to federal or national programs. So what opportunities do you see in the nonprofit space with natural climate solutions working with national entities?
So I think I think we can be that bridge. One of the things that, the Nature Conservancy does in the U.S. is we actually use some of these same farm programs on agricultural lands that we own and operate, and then we invite our neighbors in to see how it's working, right? And we provide, lands that the Nature Conservancy manages become those sort of living lands, so that the neighbors and the farmers that live around them are living labs, so the neighbors around them can see what's working and what doesn't. They provide, teaching opportunities. But, we are working with financial organizations to look at new structures to de-risk. We're working with governments and participating in some of these climate smart commodity programs. And we, partner with fellow NGOs. And one of the reasons I came to TNC, I haven't been in this seat for very long, is that we have both the scientists, we have the stories from the farmers we've worked with directly to say what's worked and what hasn't, and of course we have our whole policy-making arm to sort of package those best practices into ideas and legislative language that can become the policies for tomorrow that take into account what we've learned today. So we can and we should keep doing all those things.
Yes, excellent. So I'm going to ask you another question, but then, just giving you a heads up, I'm going to ask you, is there a question you would like to ask somebody else in the panel, or just a short reflection you would like to make on something else that you heard somebody else say? But before I ask you that, I have a question, first of all, specifically for Dallas. And Dallas, this is something you've alluded to already, but if you could just give us a bit more on this. How do nature-based climate solutions fit into your nation's visions for what your land, your water, your local economy, and the reconciliation process that is underway here in our country? How do they fit into your visions? What does that look like?
Wow.
Not a small question.
Luckily enough, I've been doing this for 25 years, where we started from scratch. And our relationships were built on transactional relationships. And so everything had to be commodified, which I alluded to earlier. To protect 80% of our territories in the Great Bear Rainforest, there is a price tag with that. The philanthropic community was willing to put in certain dollars for amount of hectarage that came in there. And we learned to take that $120 million program, and we've leveraged it into $450 million to this date to help us find those nature-based solutions and build that conservation economy. And we're able to do that because we're building partnerships. We're not waiting for a government program to come out and develop for us. So we're getting the investment that's necessary for us to figure it out and to work with all the stakeholders that we need to. And that's, again, why it was so important for the announcement Prime Minister Trudeau made last week, is now we're looking at ocean-based solutions to add to that economy. Again, for First Nations people, there's no difference between our coastal territories and our mainland territories. It's all interconnected, and we've understand that from a biodiversity value, that's really where we need to start. And so having the ability to have that investment and leverage it into homegrown opportunities has really set us a little bit of apart right now, and we've been able to be the leading edge of the wedge, if you will, for how Indigenous communities can take back what's rightfully theirs, but understanding how it's shared with everybody else that's, inhabiting our territories now.
Absolutely. And what opportunities do you see in your sectors to work more closely with First Nations and with Indigenous peoples?
I can go next. Yeah, it's a great question. We've recently, FPAC put together a conservation report just last week. We published that. So looking at, really there's three components to the report. One is around how biodiversity conservation is built into sustainable forest management. The other is around climate smart forestry and the opportunity around mitigation. But the other one is the growing participation and Indigenous held tenure in Canada. So now 10% of the national wood supply is held by Indigenous peoples, and there's more opportunity to do more. And it can look, there's different types of ways that can happen. We see limited partnerships, we see joint ventures, we see Indigenous owned areas. So we're seeing a lot of movement there, which is great. And even last week I was on a panel talking about conservation areas with the Mi'kmaq First Nation, and so there's been a transfer of forest tenure to that nation, or I think it's really close to being signed. But then it's self-determination. It's that opportunity to practice forestry, but do it in a way that meets the values and needs of the community. So we're really kind of looking to see where there are best practices across our members and across Canada. And then seeing where we can help. Sometimes it's knowledge, capacity. Sometimes it's actually helping to advocate for funding together to the federal government. So, I think it's a really exciting opportunity in Canada. So,
I'd just like to highlight something you mentioned, which is helping to share best practices. Because that's something I see too in science. So often you might be studying or working in a certain place, in a certain system, and you discover there's something that really works well. But we would save so much time, so much effort, if we could spread those best practices around the world. And so one of the reasons why I, as a scientist, want to work with the Nature Conservancy is because if you're working in 80 countries around the world with over 700 scientists on staff, we can rapidly disseminate those types of best practices, not only across a country, but around the world. And we can all learn from each other. So that's really interesting. But now is this a harder question for you to answer? In the ag community, what does it look like to partner with Indigenous peoples and First Nations? Or is this something that is already advancing, and if so, what's happening?
Yeah, I think just as some very specific and, of course, high-level examples as well. I think specifically it's been one of our Saskatchewan, Manitoba members' long-standing resolutions for us to advocate for more support for the Indian Head Tree Nursery in Saskatchewan, which has recently been handed over to the Carry the Kettle First Nation. It was a great source of nature-based solutions for farmers over the last number of years, obviously through carbon sequestration provided by tree planting, as well as the soil erosion control benefits as well. I think the nature of the NCS funding provides a potential bridge, I think, to reach out and ensure that we can kind of get some movement underway here on the near horizon. And I think just at the high level as well, we've sat with Indigenous stakeholders on a number of higher level committees, the Species at Risk Advisory Council, for example, as well as recently the Agricultural Species at Risk Core Planning Team through AFC. I think one of the priorities we do try to ensure with engagement, with the opportunity to provide input, is to ensure that it happens as early in the process as possible. Yeah.
And then Darcy, for nonprofits and NGOs, what do you see as the opportunities partnering with Indigenous peoples and First Nations?
Oh, goodness, many of them, right? And can I, just something that had been sitting with me while they answered this question is I think when we talk about in agriculture and in forestry and, unlocking the potential of nature-based solutions, a lot of times we talk about technology. But when we say technology, I think at least in maybe the, U.S. mindset, that goes to, AI or gene editing or what is the biggest, newest technology. But sometimes it's the simplest technology and it's traditional ways of knowing that give us some of the answers we need. And in combining the very simple, known, tried and true practices with some of our more advanced ways of measurement and understanding why those traditional practices were so important, and what they bring to the ecosystem. And if you think about cover cropping or intercropping or agroforestry, those are really ancient practices, and we're now understanding, wait a second, we kind of pushed them out for a monocropping approach, and now we need to bring them back in and embrace those, because we realize all of the services that they were providing. So I think reminding ourselves, one, of what those First Nations and Indigenous communities can teach us about resilience is absolutely critical. And I think, again, bringing those stakeholders together, I think NGOs can play a really critical role in getting stakeholders around the same table and play a convening role that can sort of amplify some of those experiences. And as we are, looking at what is the policy solution, creating spaces for full stakeholder input is actually one of the critical things that we can and should do.
Because we know that the more voices we have at the table, the more robust and resilient solutions we end up with. And I love the way you redefine technology, or defined it accurately, I should say, because, just look at biochar, right? Biochar is you take agricultural waste, you burn it at high temperature, the carbon comes out as sort of a gray powder, and you plow that back into the ground, where it is like, one ag professor told me, Miracle Grow on steroids. Where did the concept of biochar come from? Indigenous peoples in the Amazon. And in fact, you can dig down layers and layers and layers of soil to actually determine how many decades and centuries they have been practicing that type of agriculture in that location. So now I wanted to ask you, did you have a reflection that you haven't had an opportunity to share on something somebody else said, or do you have a question you'd like to ask another panel member? Now's your chance.
I guess I would be interested in hearing from the other panelists, what's the biggest barrier to participation in, the foresters, the farmers, the Indigenous communities that you work with? And it might be a big one, but it might be a really small one too. Like, is it paperwork? Is it, what's the thing that maybe from a policy standpoint we could tackle to sort of get over the hump?
I'll go first. Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there right off the bat. I think paperwork, when it comes down to it, lowering, it's a fact. Yeah, lowering administrative burden, I think, can be a real key tool in terms of overcoming one of those initial challenges as well. I think when it comes down to the details, looking at the nature of cost shares, for example, if it's a 50-50, what's the minimum amount that is required for that investment into, for example, the Agricultural Clean Technology Program, which is a great resource for input management tools that do kind of help lower costs and also reduce incidents of runoff, for example, during extreme weather events. Minimum cost buying for that can be sometimes 20 grand, I believe. And we have some small family farmers who may not have the cash available to make that initial investment, but they'd really benefit greatly from being able to buy in. So it's, I think, adjusting those real devil in the details aspects, which I'm pleased to say that's where we're at now with NCS funding. So,
Great answer and great question. Kate.
It is a great question. Thank you, Darcy. So, because I think carbon accounting around removals is difficult in the land sector. So we really struggle to understand and isolate changes in activities and to quantify the mitigation potential of that, and then the realized potential of that, or the realized mitigation. Particularly in Canada, because it's a large country and it's very much, or large portions of Canada, particularly the boreal forest, is under a disturbance-driven ecosystem. So it has relied for thousands of years on fire and forest pests that are not invasive species. And so it's understanding what emissions are going up into the atmosphere as a result of natural disturbance, what is the anthropogenic or the human caused component of that, and then what proactive or progressive measures do we take, and what is the benefit? So it's super complicated when you get into offsets and things like that to say what's the counterfactual, like what would happen if you hadn't taken that action. So just to say, I find it really challenging. I wish it was easier. I think in areas of coastal forests it is a little easier, because these are areas that don't undergo the same kind of natural disturbance or much longer time frames with fire and things like that. The other challenge from our perspective, or the barrier, I would say is sometimes a lot of movement and a lot of policy direction, and I touched on it before, but there can actually be policies that are counterproductive with action. And so that's why I really do support kind of sectoral strategies or working together to understand, okay, let's identify those barriers. And sometimes it's accounting methodology, but sometimes it's really just finding those pathways. And I think we're getting better and better to name those pathways, and then how do we move forward together on those. So.
Okay, so paperwork and sort of initial investments, accounting, which is where a lot of the science comes in, and making sure that we're not accidentally doing the wrong thing by trying to do the right thing. And now, Dallas, from your perspective, what are the greatest challenges and hurdles you face?
Status quo. There's a comfort level in status quo that has been killing Indigenous people around the world for centuries now. But I think the solution to that is capacity building. I think, again, I keep Great Bear is where I come from. It's what I do. But through working with conservation partners and things, we built 1,100 full-time jobs that aren't dependent on the falling of a tree or the catching of a fish. And so breaking down the capacity needs of local communities across the board is really the solution going forward. And I think that's something that we're really starting to see take place in Canada, is we're seeing that real hard discussion taking place of how do you go from status quo to something that's a positive step forward. Because at the same time, we're still finding unmarked graves from residential schools and the impacts of those issues. And so we talked about resiliency, the resiliency of our communities to get past those social issues to contribute to a collaborative effort going forward based on climate solutions. I think Canada is both a horribly tragic but wonderfully optimistic place at the same time. And I'm really glad to be a part of it and build the partnerships that we built with many of the people who are in the audience right now and trying to just change status quo.
Thank you. So we're going to go to audience questions in just a few minutes, but before we do, I have a speed round for you.
Lightning round.
Yes. 2 questions, 1 short answer to each question. The first question is this. So Canada has already made significant investments in NCS, and there's been, announcements in the United States as well, including a nature-based solutions roadmap, billions in new nature-based investments under the Inflation Reduction Act. If you could make one key policy recommendation to Canada, if you could literally say, just do this, what would this be? Who wants to go first? Frank, you look like you have something.
Yeah, sure. I think don't shy away from those big moonshot ideas that might push some of the boundaries of primary research. We see that kind of being a big key component of the research ecosystem, particularly in the States. Just incentivizing that level of innovation, I think is something that would really do Canada quite well in terms of being a leader.
Okay, so go big. Don't be afraid. Be innovative. I love that. And be a leader. Kate, you look like you have an idea.
Yeah.
One piece of advice.
And I think it is looking at the positive components of the Inflation Reduction Act. So what we don't have in Canada is, and Minister Freeland mentioned this in the fall economic statement, which is, industrial policy suite that can accelerate sustainable, inclusive, sectors that can move forward. And so we're very keen for the federal government to do this, but recognize it needs to be also fitting within an adaptation framework, reconciliation framework, biodiversity framework, but really how do we achieve that climate mitigation opportunity, and then where are the key sectors ready to take action, and then let's just be very disciplined and coordinated on having that roadmap developed and actioned and funded appropriately.
So a holistic approach that brings everybody in, but then also the people who are ready to go, push them out in front.
Exactly,
All right.
exactly. And and forestry with mass timber, biofuels is ready to go. So
Okay, that's good to know. One piece of policy advice. Darcy, you look ready to go. All right.
I think so. I mean, I would just say don't wait, and maybe a little bit controversial, but I would say, like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we're waiting here on how do we measure it precisely and exactly how much carbon, but we know what practices work. And so my advice would be pay for practice. Get the practices in the field. We can measure it and value it precisely later. But I think we have a good idea, kind of a proxy of that worth. So let's just get it on as many acres as possible and get moving.
Well, I was so glad to hear you say that. That is my absolute bugbear. People who will not, spare any opportunity to make the perfect the enemy of the good. We don't have time for that. And I love that you did a little happy dance too when she said that, because
It was a happy dance, but that's exactly where I was going to go.
go for it.
And so now that that's been said, I mean, it's only plagiarism in college. The more we can learn from each other to go forward. But I see my friend Elizabeth May there, and just give us our land back. Get more Indigenous people involved in all aspects of politics so we can bring this message forward, so we can actually build policy for our people, by our people, with the input from our people. So I should have went before you. We made that at minute, and I was like, go ahead.
Not at all. This is the first time we've been on a panel together, but I've already learned give you the last word every time because he will bring it home. All right. So now this last question is completely off script. I'm sorry. It was not on any agenda. But this is the question that I, as a climate scientist, have been asked more than any other question for the last 5 years. No matter where I go, no matter who I'm speaking to, I could be speaking to students, I could be speaking to senior citizens, I could be speaking to Netflix employees, I could be speaking to Catholic nuns. No matter who I'm speaking to, this is the question I get. And so I want to hear your answers to this question. What gives you hope? Darcy, we'll start with you.
I mean, this. From being the kid who was made to cry at the school bus to having like days worth of programming at the climate COP, having a whole conversation around, layering on both climate and biodiversity solutions. The fact that those words roll off people's tongues took a long time to get here, but we're here, right? And what makes me really excited is when you start talking about some of these things in agriculture, how many young people are excited to get their hands dirty and to think about interacting with nature. I mean, the average age of a farmer in the US is inching up towards 60, right? And so adopting something completely new, changing mindset, that's hard. But when you go to meetings talking about this, the average age of the farmers in the room that are ready to take the reins is in their 30s, and they've got a long time to invest and are excited. And that gives me a lot of hope, the energy and the excitement around participating.
That would. So people, especially young people, when we see them getting engaged. Frank, what gives you hope?
That's exactly what gives me hope as well. I'm starting to get concerned you're stealing answers, but it's extremely well put. I almost can't even add anything to it. But there is that concern across Canada we see with some of our stakeholders, and that there's difficulty sometimes with intergenerational farm transfers in terms of making sure that farms do continue on within families. Concerned that perhaps young folks have worries about taking on such a broad sector that maybe that's extremely impacted by climate change. But those are where the actual big idea solutions are happening. When it kind of gets down to that young farmer level. Yeah.
And the bright lights.
And the bright lights. Yeah.
Kate, what gives you hope?
I think just the inclusiveness of this conversation. I feel I represent industry, and perhaps in the past I would not have been invited to this panel, or to a panel at COP27, and to talk about how industry is willing to make improvements, to recognize the contribution to climate change and to biodiversity conservation. So what gives me hope is that we're part of the conversation. It's around relationships with people and building trust, and that's happening, which is so exciting. And then I really, I love seeing success stories and those being shared, and I love seeing the pride within local communities, within the profession, I work with foresters and biologists every day, and seeing the pride that they know that, the conservation of that wetland or shifting their product line to a more longer-lived product is helping the climate, and it's helping biodiversity. So that gives me hope.
Seeing the actual solutions and seeing people proud of the solutions that they helped with, how can that not give us hope? Dallas, I know you have something good for us. What gives you hope?
Tomorrow. In all honesty, I think just seeing the younger generation take their role as leaders in all of our communities, not just Indigenous communities, but as you all were saying, the next generation has seen the challenges in front of them and they're ready to take it on and they're educated to do it. I'm so happy. I mean, I see my friend Tyson Alio there, who's both educated culturally, professionally, and is building a path that other people are following. And so having more Indigenous youth getting educated, and I wish more would come home to work for their communities, but I'm glad they're going out to work for other communities because they're bringing that perspective and that discussion that's really happening now. And I think, like you said, this is one of the first international conferences where I've seen we really talk collaboratively with all the people who need to be a part of the solution. So that's what gives me hope. Yeah. And getting out tomorrow with the runway and snow, but that's just personal and private.
Definitely. I think what I've noticed is that a lot of the news that we read is specifically either neutral or negative. And it's because negative news gets the clicks. So I've done experiments before. I went to I picked a news site on a random day, and I just counted how many stories were positive, neutral, or negative. If it's CBC, you get a lot of neutral and a few negatives. If it's something that's for profit, like CNN, you get a few neutral, a ton of negatives, but you don't get positives. But when we go out and we look, and that's why I want to ask each of you, is because we each have stories of people, and each of you have stories too. When we go out and we look to see what is already happening, what a difference that's making on the ground to real people's lives in real places, and then when we share those stories with people around us, that is how we spread hope, and hope can truly be contagious. And so that is a rule, I think, for all of us, wherever we are, in all of our different circles that you were talking about, is to share the stories that we hear, to share the hope that we hear, because when you see that it can be done, that's what makes us realize we could be part of that solution too. So now we want to hear from you. If you have a question with a question mark at the end of it that can be expressed briefly, please feel free to stand up, identify yourself, who you are, what organization you're with, and ask the question. You're welcome to direct it to a specific panelist, or you are welcome to open it up. Elizabeth.
Sorry, I will try to follow your instructions, Catherine, because you're such an excellent science communicator, and you do such a brilliant job of creating the space where people can be together and not on opposite sides. I happen to come from you directly from a workplace committed to the opposite, a toxic workplace of accepted bullying. It's called Parliament. And so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth May. I'm Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, leader of the Green Party. This is the traditional Green Party moment. It's called Attack the Sponsor. RBC has put more money into fossil fuels in the last 5 years than any other Canadian company. They need to be called out, even if they use their money for good things like helping Nature United. Sorry, that was just a brief heritage moment. I want to specifically focus on agriculture because the divide is the thing that we're not talking about right now. And I'll try to be really brief, but this conversation I had with an Alberta farmer who really thinks the climate agenda is against him. And I said, but I was trying to get it around, like you say, to where we can have an agreement. I knew he'd had a brutal year because of drought. So how was the year for you with your crop? And he said, well, in the end, it was kind of okay because I planted barley. Well, the drought was awful, so I only brought in about half the crop we normally would. But because of the war in Ukraine, the price for barley has spiked, so I actually broke even. It was a pretty good year, except, of course, the inputs cost so much more. So because of the war in Ukraine, his fossil fuels cost more. So did the nitrogen fertilizer because of tariffs we placed on Russian fertilizer. But in Parliament, so my question is really to Frank, in Parliament, every time farmers are mentioned in the climate context, it's someone getting up and saying the climate agenda is against farming. And I keep thinking, no, I mean, farmers are in this crucible of being completely at risk from climate crisis, from flooding that you can't get your crops in, that they're not wet, like that harvest from hell. But right now, I'd put it to Frank, there's not a single government policy that would persuade any conventional, not your family, Darcy, any conventional farmer would not see a single policy coming at them from the climate agenda when we need farming like crazy to store carbon in the soil and get it right and change our practices around livestock. There's not a single farmer would have any reason, I don't think, to believe the climate agenda is anything other than against them personally. And they take it personally, so there's anger. So how do we fix that, and what kind of policies would you want to see? Green Party believes we should pay farmers for ecological services. I'll just put it out there, but I'll stop there, and thank you.
Yeah, I want to applaud you. What a fantastic point. I think it really does lead to, hits the core of one of our big issues of the last number of years especially, which is a lot of the targets for environment, we do see them come down from on high. Our stakeholders often don't feel as though there's been consultation at the outset in terms of really setting those percentages. You know, what amounts do we want to reduce, for example, looking at the fertilizer emission reduction strategy that came out a couple years ago. I think that communication barrier, I think in terms of really communicating the goal of policies, at times it's more directed towards, I want to say, perhaps the environmental side of the conversation as opposed to directly towards primary producers, who of course, as we know, are on the environmental side, as you pointed, with respect to nature-based solutions. But yeah, I think you do really want to target messaging. So it really conveys the goal of actual policy. The key way to do that, I think, is to break down that silo probably between Environment Canada and Agriculture Canada to ensure that when goals are set by ACCC, farms are in the room. As the minister raised earlier at the outset here, a working group was struck at the start of this week, the Sustainable Ag Strategy Program. I have the privilege of being the co-chair of the time being. Our goal is to really reach out to industry groups to ensure that they were in the room when these conversations do happen, so that the strategy itself doesn't come as a fully formed, finalized item for a rubber stamp, that it does have that direct primary producer input at the outset. So I'm hopeful for that. I do hope it comes through. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. That is a great idea. All right, another question here. Please identify yourself and give us your question.
My question is also to do with RBC, so thank you, Elizabeth, for the plug. And this is in the context of acknowledging that none of you are direct representatives of RBC as far as I know, but all right. Well, maybe this question is for you in the room. The Royal Bank of Canada is the biggest funder of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is being drilled through the unceded Wet'suwet'en territory, where endangered salmon are spawning, and this is only one of the many extractive projects that RBC is funding, including, for example, the Trans Mountain pipeline. And it's this kind of colonial extraction that is the reason we have arrived at these problems in the first place, for which we need so-called natural climate solutions. If we're thinking about climate action, and we actually want to get to the heart of the problem, we need to deconstruct the fossil economy. When is RBC going to divest from these pipelines, from these industries that are the architecture of the problem that require these solutions? And where is the space in this conversation to put pressure on RBC to divest? Thank you.
I think that this panel can speak to the second half of that, and I would actually broaden that, if you don't mind, because we know from a scientific perspective that we can't develop new oil, gas, or coal. Because if we do, we won't meet the 1.5-degree target. We need nature-based solutions to take what we already have in the atmosphere out, but we really need to shift our perspective on our energy sources. So, Dallas, do you want to lead off by commenting on that? Okay.
In all seriousness, this is why these dialogues need to happen. We need to sit down and figure out, because it's not a light switch. We know that, and I don't want to sound like the assholes in the room, but communities have voted for that as well, which is where the challenge comes from, is who is actually going to make these decisions. And that's a discussion that we really need to continue to further in our First Nations communities so we can work better with our partners on what that path is. And so the challenge is out there is how do we turn that off and move towards something else? And that's where we talked about, let's not let perfect get in the way of good enough for now. And so I do think we need to start leaning in that direction. And I'm very glad to see that youth from all sides of society are challenging leadership on these decisions that, in the big picture, are bad decisions. And that's not really much of an answer. It's a more of a political just observation of the challenge that's there. But there's a lot of people putting their heads around having that challenge. And I think that's one of the frustrating things for Indigenous people is we get caught in the tug of war of it. And I think Wet'suwet'en really needs to continue to sit down and try find what they want to see happen in their territories and then bring in the allies to help them achieve that. Bit of a cop-out, but...
I don't think so. And I think that you've raised a very important point, which is that these decisions are being made by multiple organizations, multiple people at every level. And so whoever we are, wherever we are, we each have roles to play. Kate, did you want to?
One thing I would add, and I'm not going to address the comment so directly, but I think agriculture and forestry are actually going to be a couple of allies moving forward when we talk about clean fuels, when we talk about biodiesel and these types of things. So if we want to continue, there will be a transition with fossil fuel, but there is an opportunity to increase the amount of renewable fuel in those mixes moving forward. And probably agriculture will be ready to go first, but we're hoping that forestry with residue, that's waste, that would otherwise actually be burnt and go up into the atmosphere, that can go into, so there's a project actually starting very soon in Prince George with Canfor, one of our members, RBS, to refine and make biodiesel that can go into aviation fuel. So anyway, just to say that, we're here to help with that transition. But I also just kind of welcome the dialogue and yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah.
And I think that you also raised a very important point, which is we have to know what we're moving towards as well as what we're moving away from. And so we need that vision of what does a clean energy future look like? What does an efficient energy future look like? What does a world where people live in harmony with nature look like? And so as we're looking at what we had, we want to also know where we're going. And I think that that is a great note to end this panel on. So thank you, all of you, for participating. And thank you for your questions. All right, the panel can leave the stage. But you can't leave your seats yet because we're not done. And to close our panel, it is now my pleasure to invite John Stackhouse to share some key takeaways from our discussion. So John has been sitting there in the front row. He has been taking careful notes. I have noticed him. He has been thinking about, and I know he already thinks very deeply about issues of agriculture, forestry, natural climate solutions, and how in Canada we can invest in these solutions for a better future for all of us. John serves as Senior Vice President in the Office of the CEO at RBC, and he's in charge of leading RBC's research and thought leadership on economic, technological, and social change. John, please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Your patience. I am the guy from RBC and happy to speak to all the issues or questions you might have. I've been given only 5 minutes to sum up what we just heard, but I'll be around afterwards. As I've been here through the week, you reflect on how weak we are as a species. You hear about all the wrong we're doing. And this panel reminded me a lot of what's good about humanity and what our strengths are, whether it's critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration and communications. These are things humans actually can be really good at. So thank you to the panel for reflecting some of humanity at our best. It's also been really important this week to reflect on the diversity of voices and diversity of thought. Diversity of thought is critical to diversity of nature. And it's so refreshing that we have a democratic COP and that we can hear diversity of voices, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, even ones that we may disagree on. Maybe they give us something to reflect on, and that diversity of thought and open conversation is something we should all continue to fight for. As I thought about the diversity of thought on the panel today, there were so many great thoughts, but there were 5 words that I took away as key words. Number 1 was partnership. This is going to take a village. And it was really interesting to see on the stage a farmer, a forester, an Indigenous community leader, a business person now, a scientist, before that, a philanthropist and a government leader. Think of what coalitions like this can do together, far more than any of us are able to do on our own. Second keyword, tradition. Dallas, thank you for that. So many of our best assets are ones that were given to us free by previous generations. So let's borrow more from the past than perhaps we borrow from the future as we think about ways forward. Third keyword, health. How do we calculate, measure, and assess the health impact of all that we do, the health of nature, but also the health of all of us in our decisions? Fourth word, resilience. Resilience of nature, we've talked a lot about through this week and last week, but resilience of people and resilient communities are going to be critical to what we do in biodiversity. And fifth word, for me, keyword, was innovation. And when we say innovation, we often think of technology, what's going to be that amazing gizmo that's going to save us all. But we can innovate in our practices. We see that in agriculture and forestry, amazing innovations. We can innovate with finance to ensure that capital gets to where it needs to be. One of my takeaways from this week is on the financing gap. It's clear that we're short roughly $700 billion a year that's going to be needed for biodiversity. Sad news is governments are probably tapped out. There's not a whole lot more governments can invest in this sector. Philanthropy, close to tapping out, almost at a ceiling. But there's huge pools of capital out there in the world that are ready to be mobilized for all the ideas that we've talked about here in biodiversity. It's something we think a lot about at RBC. We innovated, transformed our sustainable finance framework this fall to ensure that biodiversity is included and that we are able to finance biodiversity investments. We're putting more than $100 billion a year now towards sustainable finance. And we think that's going to continue to grow because there's so much demand out there in the world from our partners, our clients, to invest, to find sustainable finance opportunities, including for biodiversity. So let's work together, let's partner, let's collaborate to find ways to leverage those big pools of private capital that we're going to need to get through some of these challenges. But as the panel stressed, it's going to take more than money. Money is going to be really critical, but we're going to need more than money. We're going to need policy changes, and it was great to hear some of the policy ideas here mentioned. For us, one of the big policy challenges is how to help local communities access global capital. You know, it's easier often for us to finance an Indigenous community in the United States than it is in Canada. That's bonkers. It's easier for us to finance a town in the United States than it is in Canada because of municipal financing. That's also bonkers. Let's get on with changing that because, in a simple way, we know climate is global. Nature in many ways is local. And it's going to be local communities and local coalitions that solve this, but they're going to need global capital and finance to help them do that. We're going to need partnerships. How do we work together differently? We're spending a lot of time at RBC on agriculture, and we're lucky to be part of a growing coalition that's exploring regenerative agriculture, working with Nature United, but also with companies like Loblaw and Nutrien and amazing farmers across the country to find and develop ways to use soil to sequester carbon, but also to strengthen the soil, and critically to reward farmers for that. They are the stewards of the land. They're already doing this. We're just not rewarding them for it. We think there are economic models that can help us through market mechanisms and pricing reward farmers for what they are already doing, but we've got to do it in partnership. Technology. We heard about technology. Tech for Nature is a really neat commitment at RBC where we're putting $100 million on the table for innovators, communities, as well as technologists to develop new ideas, new practices, and yes, new gizmos that we're going to need to conquer some of the challenges that we see in both biodiversity and climate. And then lastly, we need ideas. We need all the ideas we're hearing more and exponentially more. It's something we're trying to champion at RBC through thought leadership. We put out a paper recently called The Next Green Revolution that shares ideas on how Canada can produce food with fewer emissions. But it's not a report that we're slamming on the table. It's an invitation for conversation. So please share your ideas with us. Go to rbc.com/thoughtleadership. You'll find our research there, but share your ideas. Invite us to conversations. Criticize us. Help us learn, but share those ideas with others so that we can all be on this learning journey together. which takes me to the final word from today that I jotted down, which is openness. Openness. Nature teaches us about openness. There are no firm boundaries in nature because there's too much interconnectivity and reliance. We all know we depend on each other. It's how we survive, it's how we thrive, but it's also how we grow through sharing. So let's continue to be open. Thank you to the panel for your openness. Thank you, Catherine, for your inspiration. More voices equal more solutions. That's my homework. More voices equal more solutions. So let's be open to each other's voices, and we'll find those solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was live streamed. It was also recorded. You are welcome to share that and, as John said, continue the discussion. Thank you.